So today I want to talk about a few things, and really the whole thing is wrapped up in this idea of the edges of lighting design. And it's something that I've become aware of that I tend to work in. Now that's a good start, isn't it? There we go. It's quite often said that lighting design is somewhere between an art and a science, and that there's this continuum, this line that covers the two extremes, and design sits somewhere in the middle between the two. And it's quite a common theme, and we tend to take that on board quite a lot. That allows us a bit of freedom, technical and sometimes artistic, because we say it's design, it's okay. But in a sense, this kind of diagram says that art and science are actually at two polar opposites, that they are not the same thing, and that design is somehow in the middle. But where do other disciplines, like engineering, exist in this kind of diagram? Are they more scientific? Are they more art? Well, we probably inherently think they're probably not more artistic, so they must be closer to science. But this is very one-dimensional. There is nowhere else we can go on this line. We're somewhere on the line. And where does other things sit? There's something missing in that as well, and it's something that Jack Howe said about intuition. I believe in intuition. I think that's the difference between a designer and an engineer. Now, that's very unfair on the creative engineers. We all know that there are lots of creative engineers out there. But we also, as design professionals, we understand the sentiment of this. That in a sense, design is about something more than just factual information. And intuition in some way captures that description. Now, this quotation comes from Nigel Cross's Design Thinking book, wonderful, very small book. Even for me, it's easy to read. And Nigel Cross himself said, "It may be that designers are overlooking the experience that they have gathered. Their intuitive responses may be derived from these large pools of experience. We all behave intuitively at times when we respond to situations that are familiar." And that's the thing, as professional designers, we tend to forget, is actually how much experience we have and how that experience influences what we do. So there's something missing in this diagram, and perhaps we need to think of another way of expanding it. And the thing that's missing is craft or experience. And if we add that in as a third point, we create this triangle. So that's where our intuition, our experience actually sits. And then science is analysis, art is vision. And what that means is that design now moves from on the line to somewhere in the middle. There are elements of design which are artistic, that are scientific, that are craft, and all of them are equally important. And different kinds of design exist in different places. We need a little bit of each for it to work. A media facade might be towards the artistic side, theatre somewhere between craft and art, retail in there as well. Street lighting might be, in some situations, completely about craft, about experience, about what is normally done. Lighting for health might be seen on the scientific side of this model. Museums, partly scientific, partly craft. Offices, perhaps in the middle. But the point here is that lighting design is an area. It is not a single point in this kind of diagram. And we need to appreciate this, and we need to talk to other people about lighting design not being a specific place, but a landscape. And conferences like this, that are focusing on light and health, are a part of a landscape. And we need to explain to others that it is a very broad area. Lighting design is not a single point. So let's look at some examples from different parts of this diagram through the use of some projects. We'll start with art, because I am an artist by training. In fact, it's the only thing I'm qualified for. Despite years and years of lighting design and now years and years of teaching lighting design, I'm not qualified as a lighting designer, because when I grew up, there wasn't really an option. Lighting designers became lighting designers accidentally. We stumbled into it. There was no other way of doing it. But art still informs a lot of my projects, and this project here was for a small science festival in Dunbar, near Edinburgh, where I live. And it was based on scientific ideas. Ignore that. And one of the ideas that it was inspired by was actually, because it's a science festival, was the work of James Clerk Maxwell and his electromagnetic theory. And translating these ideas into visual representations. And this is one of the sketches for one of the harmonic pathway, which is a representation of the electromagnetic spectrum. And this is what a bit of it looked like. Now, the site is an old lighthouse, and it's light art, it was projection, it was sound design. We even had a fire eater as well, which was quite scary. And I'm kind of interested in projects like this because, yes, it's light art, but actually how does this influence my design practice? And are they actually different things? But because I'm so interested in lots of scientific ideas, I'm not a scientist, so these are kind of easy to understand ideas like the particle theory, the wave theory. They do work into the projects that I'm doing. And there's lots of projection in this, there's lots of light in it, and actually where is the boundary between the two? At what point am I acting as a designer in this situation, and at what point am I being an artist? Now, it could be that you could say I was being either, but really I'm being both. Because I know as an artist, I'm not qualified to be able to make some of these sort of things work, but as a designer, I know how to do it. So again, I need both sides. So Mark showed this image already, and luckily he didn't say what I'm going to say about it. Yes, there's lots of darkness in it, but actually the reason I've put it in here is that this project, Spears and Major were employed as light artists. Now, at the time when I was working at Spears and Major, I was personally quite annoyed that the client wanted to employ designers as artists, because that's not the same thing. Now, having said that, obviously the result is fantastic, but the principle of the difference between the two, now in of people actually not understand, sense what they did want was designers, because they wanted a solution that was a design solution, not just an artistic solution. It had to be permanent, it had to work, it had to be reliable. And most artists, there are some great light artists out there, but most artists are not really qualified to make those design decisions. Light Design Collective, as a practice, is a really interesting proposition, because they truly are sitting almost outside lighting design, having come through lighting design practice, education practice, and almost out the other side as well. This is very much about practice, it's about light art, it's about interaction, it's about many, many things. And as Tapio talks about, creative coding as well. This is kind of moving into areas of creative computer science. And again, is it lighting design? We don't know. It's definitely on the edge. It's possibly sometimes over the edge. And we all have our own definitions of where the borders might be. Let's have a look at craft. Now, by craft, what I'm talking about is experience. So this is experienced designers using their intuitive knowledge and intuitive understanding. And in a way, what Mark was talking about earlier is a lot of knowledge, understanding, experience, and intuitive responses to spaces, knowing that it will be enough light. And genuinely, when I was at Spears and Major, there were lots of project discussions where we said, it will be fine, it will be okay. We were asked for proof and said, just trust us. We can't prove it, we just know it will work, because intuitively we have the experience to do it. Copenhagen Opera House is a good example of that. Where the original brief was to actually externally uplight the roof of the building. But in the end, we didn't do that at all. Now, it looks lit because the building becomes a lantern. And actually, we completely inverted the brief so that the internal part of the building became what the project was about, and not about the exterior, which is what originally the architects thought the project was about, because they recognised the building through their iconic drawings of it, and the roof was very important for them. But we said to them, there's other ways of doing this, and perhaps the light can reveal things that you can't see during the day, and the inside of the auditorium was one part of that. Now, this project was actually built on a series of artistic visions, in a sense, and one of those visions was actually the rationale for where the light is within the space, within this atrium space. And what you see is lines of light along the floor edges. And the artistic rationale there is that the light actually exists within the building. And the floor edges have been cut to allow these chasms as you cross into the back of the auditorium. And where the floor is cut, the light pours out. It's a very simple idea. It is not important that any of the visitors know that that is the concept, but it's a strong artistic concept that allowed us to rationalize where light should be and where it should not be. And the reason that we did that as an artistic concept was because as designers, using our intuitive knowledge, we knew when people are approaching the building from outside, they are looking up and they see the underside of these floor slabs. And what we didn't want them to see was hundreds and hundreds of downlights. So as much as possible, we got rid of the downlights. There's still a few, but hardly any. And the entire space is pretty much dominated by the lighting from this. I've been working at the university for some years now, and actually we've built up quite a few projects which might be seen as design projects, but they're actually coming from a research background. And this is a project for Historic Scotland that we've just completed this year, although I've got to go back and finish some other bits, because it's a client that always changes its mind after it's finished. And the project actually came out of a research proposal. When I was in my own practice at the Stone Conservation Laboratory, Historic Scotland, looking at objects for another exhibition, I was grabbed by the head of the stone collections, and he took me to see this object. And it had never been on public display. It's a 13th century effigy of a bishop from Elgin Cathedral. And he just asked me, he said, hypothetically, if someone asked you to light this object, how would you do it? And I said, oh, well, you look at this and the carving is amazing, and there's all sorts of beautiful detail in this, and you see all the detail here. Even the tassels are actually carved in this, and it looks amazing. So you've got to have lighting that reveals that texture. And that then is part of the experience of the lighting designer, knowing where to put the light to reveal the texture rather than conceal it. But as we were standing and talking about the object and standing next to it, I spotted something else. And what I saw was that there's patches of colour on this object. There's also patches of pattern on this. This object originally was completely painted. We see it now as a beautiful carving, and we appreciate that, but that's not how it was intended. It was completely decorated. And in fact, when I asked, they said, oh, we've got a colour palette that we've taken tiny samples of what remains from this. And originally, it used a palette like this. It was incredibly bright and colourful. And all of that is gone. At which point I said, that's fantastic. We've got to repaint the object. No. Can't repaint the object. Can't do that. Said, no, we can. We can repaint it with light. And that became the project. So whilst in typical display, this is from a mock-up for the client to prove that this approach might work. Whilst in typical display in white light conditions, it might look something like this. If we embrace technologies and use digital projection, then we can start doing other things. We can have virtual spotlights that illuminate particular parts of the object, allowing us to reveal a story piece by piece. We can use the object itself to take the text. We no longer need to have a separate text panel, and the text can become part of the storyline. we can also do amazing things, like putting the color of the original object back onto the object, just temporarily, but just to tell people what it should have looked like. And luckily, they liked the idea, so they allowed us to do it. Now, for me, this is really interesting because, again, is this lighting design? I don't know. I kind of maybe need you to tell me. Because I'm doing it as a lighting designer, I'm using this technology and I'm appropriating it as a designer to deliver something that I can't do any other way. But is it craft? Is it art? Is it lighting design? I'm not sure. But the important thing for me is, as a lighting designer, if I don't embrace this technology, someone else will. And if someone else takes on the task of doing this sort of thing, as designers, we've lost our access to this kind of project. And that becomes very sad. I'll just touch on something that, in a wider sense, Mark was also talking about as well, is the lighting of our streets. And in my earlier diagram, which I could probably argue that every single area of design is in the wrong place, and it could be anywhere else. But street lighting I've kind of got down as a craft. It's much more about experience. It's about what is normally done. But the question I've got is, is street lighting always mundane and purely craft? Well, clearly not. This is the lighting for a street. And Mark has shown us lots of wonderful examples of Spears and Major projects as well, which are urban environments, which we might say in a broader sense are street lighting because that's how normally they would be done, but it doesn't have to be like that. People actually see projects like this and they love it. There's something about the feel of these kind of spaces. Now, we're just embarking on another live research project in Edinburgh, in the World Heritage Site, working with the World Heritage Trust to relight 12 historic closes. Now, the closes in Edinburgh are pedestrian spaces. They're narrow alleyways that sometimes break out into courtyards, sometimes are just about a metre wide and run sort of 50 to 100 metres. And there's lots of them, and every single one is different, and every single one has an amazing story behind it of the people who lived there and the things that happened there. And what we're doing with them is showing that we can create permanent installations that replace street lighting with something that is interpretive and more exciting. And also fundamentally, which is interesting for me as a designer, and what Mark talked about in some sense was how we can educate other people about what light can do and take ideas of darkness and show them that it is okay. Now, in this project, we're actually going one further, where we are doing genuinely community co-design. Now, this is not what we normally do as designers for co-design, where the reality is we have a meeting, we show people lots of pretty pictures, and then we ask them what they want, and then we go and do it as designers. Now, in a sense, what they're doing is just providing us with a brief. This is different. This is actually using the community, the people who live in these spaces and work in these spaces. They become the designers. And our role then becomes the facilitator, that we take them on a journey and we allow them to understand what they can do. And it means that in these spaces, the people who live there are the ones who are demanding for it to be brighter. And if they become the designers, they start embracing ideas of darkness and shadow and pattern. And also they become the guardians of this. So that in the future, if the local authority come along and start installing floodlights in their space, when actually the lighting in there is telling a story that they have chosen, then they're the ones who will complain about it. And because this is a research project, it's also about public engagement and data. Yes, we're breaking the rules of uniformity in working plane measurements, but we want to collect data about this. So why do we want to collect data? Well, if we look at sort of information theory, and we start looking at the movement from data to wisdom, We've got data as objective measurements. We then move through information, a subjective assessment of that data, through knowledge where we start organizing that information to convey something else, and finally through to wisdom. And the point of wisdom here is that we require judgment. And at this point, we are adding value. And the wisdom resides in an experienced individual. This is where craft is important. We need the experience to be able to apply wisdom. The data tells us nothing by itself. It is useful when it's in the hands of someone with experience to understand what they can do, what they can achieve with that data. And in a sense, the data to the wisdom is almost that bottom line of that triangular diagram as well. So if we take our third point on the diagram, science. Now, I'm not a scientist, but I've kind of ended up doing a lot of analysis and experimentation to try and understand some of the things that in private practice I saw. And through my experience, I understood couldn't be explained by received wisdom. And one of those is the perception of brightness at low light levels. I've done a lot of work in museum and galleries, and particularly conservation lighting. And the sad reality is that conservation lighting in most museums looks like this. And it's pretty horrible. I mean, mud is not a good description for it. That's far too good a description for it. It's worse than mud. And the reality is that certainly historically, when we were lighting these spaces with tungsten halogen sources, the norm would be to select a load of sources, point them at the object, and then dim them down until we got to 50 lux. And that's how we got such a muddy light. But the thing is, that gallery is 50 lux, and so is that gallery. And why does this one look different and feel different? Why does this one feel so good and the other one feel so bad? So this is 50 lux, but it doesn't look like it, to the point that quite often the curators will walk into the room in the process of creating this exhibition and go, that's far too bright, turn it down. Because they don't believe it. They don't believe it to be conservation lighting levels because it looks too bright, but it measures 50 lux. I started to realize that our luminance measurements are not genuinely responding to and doing that kind of work, what we see. Now, that's slightly scary because we don't actually have another way of quantifying the perception of brightness other than illuminance. So the only thing that's different here between these two projects is the color temperature, dimmed versus undimmed. Now, that took me to, once I got to the university, to actually test this theory. It was in my head for years and years, and I started to wonder if it was only me. So I did some experiments with 21 of our students to see if the received wisdom did actually stand up. So they were brightness testing, brightness matching two sources. And this is the kind of result that we got. On the left-hand side, we have the target illumination set to 50 lux. And the participants were asked to adjust the source on the right-hand side. These are tungsten halogen. So what's happening as they dim them is that they're changing color temperature. And they were asked to brightness match. And on average, this one, they were setting 25% lower because that one is a 50-watt lamp. This one is a 20-watt lamp. Therefore, you don't have to dim it as much to get to 50 lux. And actually what people were doing was matching color temperature and not actual illuminance or even luminance. They were seeing the color temperature as being a match. So that got me really excited that there is something else out there and that there's other things that we can do. And this has led on to another live project, which is kind of in the process of being written up, and we're looking for funding for our second stage of this. A filtered light project with Centre for Textile Conservation at University of Glasgow. Now, they are real scientists. They are proper scientists. They do proper science. And what we're exploring is whether wavelength-dependent damage is actually a useful metric, and does it actually work? So museums work on processes like this, that we understand if we cut out all the ultraviolet, because we shouldn't have any of that in a museum anyway. We rescale this graph, but different materials respond differently to different parts of the spectrum. But in principle, it's exponential, and the closer you are to ultraviolet, the more damaging it is. Okay, we understand that. It's very well understood. But because this is completely different shape to V lambda, it also tells us something else. That illuminance, which is measuring V lambda as closely as possible, is not a reliable indicator of damage. So we were looking at two historic dyes and a synthetic in textile conservation. Magenta, which are fairly typical, and the fading profile of these is really interesting. So this is where they started on an A-B chart, and one does that, and one does that over time, and the magenta does that. So they do not have consistent fading over different periods of time. And even more than that, if you actually split it into the spectrum, which is what we did, you see that here's for the textile trade, this is their delta E definitions of what light fastness might be, and here what might be the shape of the damage function. At different parts of the spectrum, that's the fading profile of magenta, Carthamin, and curcumin. These are only 3 samples, and they're all completely different, but not a single one of them follows the line of the Berlin function, which is what we are assuming is what all museum exhibits do. So none of them are right. Okay, very briefly, because I'm already over time, I'm going to talk about something else very briefly. Something from the middle. Office lighting. I hate office lighting, but actually the reality is what I hate is the way that office lighting is normally done. Because this is actually sadly our office at the university. I didn't have any input into this at all, but this is what it looked like when it was refurbished, and this is really bad lighting, but not because it's bad equipment, it's badly used. And one of our students actually used this as his project, and he looked at the light levels across the working plane and then redesigned it. And I gave him a brief. He was going to make new light fittings. And I said, no, let's use the existing. No, let's use the existing and see what we can do. So actually, this is about recycling. This is not a technology solution, because his solution was to remove the reflector and the optics and have a bare lamp, and then create architecture that became a luminous part of the building. It's almost anti-technology. But what he ends up with is something that's effective more than efficient. And there's the uniformity afterwards. And yes, 800 lux is way too much light. If we briefly look back at my diagram, I said that a lot of my artwork is actually inspired by science. And my art also informs the craft. It kind of gives me the theoretical background for the craft projects that I'm involved in. And particularly through museum and gallery work, that craft, that experience in the real world, has actually led me back to science to try and explore some of the things that couldn't be explained any other way. And those ideas I'm now feeding back into practice to create a genuinely evidence-based design. So, oh, that's good. Oh, I hate reading things out from. Yeah, I'm going to have to read you the quotation from Albert Einstein. Imagination is more important than knowledge. For knowledge is limited. Imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress, giving birth to evolution. And as Russell Aikoff said, intelligence is the ability to increase efficiency. Wisdom is the ability to increase effectiveness. They are not the same thing. And lighting design is about effectiveness of light. And as Mark talked about, tiny quantities of light can be very effective if used appropriately. And our task as designers is to embrace everything that scientists can provide to us, but use it wisely and use it with wisdom. And finally, research as well needs to engage with practice. Research needs to understand these weird questions that practitioners come up with all the time about why does received wisdom not explain this? We need to be sharing this information more effectively. And events like this are the brilliant, perfect way of doing it. Thank you.